We're going to see how far we're able to get in Exodus. It may be that we get through the whole book. If we do so, it will probably be because we will not go too far into the weeds about the construction of of the temple. I want to I prefer to accent the bigger picture of what is being done in the construction of the tabernacle and the significance that it has for us in Exodus. And so, if you would turn to Exodus 24, Exodus 24. This is going to be a very rich, we'll say pattern. We could say type. There's a number of things that we might use. We could say framework. We could say paradigm, whichever one of those words might help you. In the similar way that we saw that both deliverance from exile is a pattern that we see in the Old Testament that will continue to happen and find its culmination in what God does in the new covenant in Jesus. So we're going to see that what we see presented to us in the tabernacle is also going to be paradigm, framework, type, pattern for us to see that God is continuing to do something that he's already done before. And in one sense, we're able to see that that which mankind had, Adam and Eve had with God in the garden, and lost due to disobedience to God's commandment, so God is restoring in the covenant promises that he has made. One of the ways that I would ask for you to observe what is going to take place from Exodus 24 all the way to Exodus 40 is one of the things the New Testament helps us to understand is we know that we come after the fall, after the cross, but before the consummation. You ever heard a preacher say that? Like, this is you locate yourself in God's redemptive world. Therefore, because you come after the cross, you know that there are blessings that are already yours in Jesus Christ. The forgiveness of sin, the presence of the Spirit of God, the gifts of the church, right? In that sense, they're already yours. And in that way, you are partaking of those promises that God made in the new covenant. But you have not yet come to put on a glorified body. You have not entered into the final place where God will come down and dwell with his people. So there still are things that you are waiting for God to do. So in the New Testament, people call this the already and not yet. In Exodus 24 through 40, we're going to see that the covenant promises that God has made to Abraham's descendants in Sinai, which is an extension to bring forth the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, they are going to be an already and not yet fulfillment of those promises. So we'll see how this already and not yet will be developed. So I take it you were in Exodus chapter 24. Here, what we are able to see is that this is the confirmation. Some people would say this actually is the ceremony by which Israel now enters into covenant with Yahweh. And what we're able to see, and this kind of gives us how the paradigm continues. Where is this taking place? You might remember, where are they in chapter 19? We've used geography so far. So the first part of Exodus chapter 1 up to chapter 19, they were moving toward Sinai. Then they arrive at Sinai and they camp at Sinai, and they will be there for a year. And then we'll see Exodus is just going to end with Israel at Sinai. But when we got to the wilderness of Sinai, where did Moses, and we'll see here that there is a way in which Joshua goes up once. There's sort of some challenges, like did Joshua go up again? But there we see they come to Mount Sinai in the wilderness of Sinai, and the elders of Israel and the people of Israel will be waiting at the base of the mountain. They'll be restricted from the mountain, but whose presence comes down to Mount Sinai? The Lord's. And then who will go up and meet with the Lord? Moses. All right, now stop for just a moment. What does Sinai now seem to function like? A temple. And what we will see is a tabernacle is going to be constructed after the mountain of Sinai functions as the first temple when God comes down and meets with his people in covenant relationship through the mediator, Moses, and the mountain itself is the veil, if you will. So that God is behind the mountain and the people are, in that sense, they are in front of him. And it's only in this sense, Moses in this mediatorial ministry is meeting with Yahweh in his presence, we'll say, at the tent of meeting behind the veil of the mountain. Then we will go to see now Moses is giving to Israel instructions, or Moses is now learning from the Lord the instructions for the construction of the what? The tabernacle. The tabernacle. And there we will see that the function of the tabernacle is going to be, analogous to or in parallel with the function of Mount Sinai. What's the difference, however, between Sinai and the tabernacle? Exactly. Chris nailed it. The tabernacle's portable, which is indicating what? What's not yet happened.
They haven't gotten to their land.
That's right. Exactly. You guys are fantastic students of the Old Testament.
So, did you say the mountain is like the tabernacle?
Yeah, we're gonna say, yeah, that the Mount Sinai functions in Exodus 24 as a tabernacle, as a meeting place for God and his people in covenant.
So and the veil would be like the clouds.
Well, the clouds are the presence or the display of God's presence. And in one sense, the mountain, I ran out of time. I was going to draw on a whiteboard a rendering of it. But you could just imagine, in one sense, the face of the mountain. That's what we call it, right? The face of the mountain. The face of the mountain. Here's Israel, Shelley. The face of the mountain is like this, and the elders and the people are here, and the presence of the Lord is here. So the face of the mountain functions as the veil.
Oh, okay.
So Moses was, God had Moses, he placed him in the cleft as he went by. Is there any relation to the veil or and the cleft of the rock that he was placed in so that he would not see God as he went by?
I think in principle there is. I think what I would say the type, that which is purposefully given to indicate something is not necessarily in that, but rather in the tabernacle's construction that will have a veil. I think that's the type. Moses, in principle, is still having that same kind of requirement. He cannot look upon God's face. Yeah. So let's dig into Exodus 24, and here we're going to be able to see that the already is going to be that God and his covenant people is going to come down and dwell among them. And in that sense, the mountain will be the tabernacle. Then God will give the instructions to Moses for how is God's presence going to tabernacle among his covenant people as they go to the land that they have not yet been, and that they've been given, but they've not yet accomplished it. And this is the already and not yet of the book of Exodus. They already have now the presence of God coming down in in the covenant relationship, but they have not yet entered the land that God has promised to them. And the tabernacle will be that until, and this is, we'll just connect a few dots here, until that Davidic covenant is established and its promise is inaugurated, not completely fulfilled, but inaugurated when his son Solomon builds the temple. And what's the difference between the temple and the tabernacle? Yes, and where is one? It is the permanent tabernacle that is placed where? In Zion, which is in the land, right? So there's some big pictures, and we'll get into a few of the details. But in Exodus 24, let's look at now the ceremony of the covenant between Israel and God. Let's start with verses 1 and 2. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to Yahweh, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you and all shall worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come near to Yahweh, but they shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." So we're able to see that God, who initiates the ceremony? God, right? You never can you can't say this too much. You can't remember this too much. This is, in one sense, the great portrait of the sovereign grace of God over and over and over again. Does sinful man initiate a relationship with God? No. The gracious God is the one who initiates relationship with fallen man. So he calls them up, but we don't have the details of how it's going to arrange in verse 1. We know, in that sense, everybody that's a part of the ceremony are the 70 elders of Israel, Nadab and Abihu, and Moses and Aaron. But Moses alone, however, is going further up. You see that in verse 2. The people are not to come up. Verse 3, Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of Yahweh and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which Yahweh has spoken, we will do." So here we are able to see who agrees to the covenant. All the people, though who represents the people, as we've seen in verse 1. The elders of Israel are the representatives of all the people, but all the people are the ones who agreed to the covenant that God offered to them. And they say, "All the words which Yahweh has spoken, we will do." So what is the condition of the covenant relationship?
We need to be obedient.
Obedience. Obedience. This is we'll continue 4 through 8. We are going to see that the people continue they're consenting, and now they ratify the covenant that they agreed to. And Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to Yahweh. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that Yahweh has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and behold, the blood of the covenant which Yahweh has cut with you in accordance with all these words. And so how was the covenant ratified between Yahweh and Israel?
Blood.
All right, so first, they were fully informed by Moses publicly reading the book of the covenant. After that, there was consent, and then the blood of the sacrifices was sprinkled on the people. And in that sense, it was by blood the covenant was ratified. This is the ceremony for Israel to enter into the covenant relationship that they made at Sinai through Moses. So You typically will hear this referred to with three different terms. They're used synonymously. Some will call this the Mosaic covenant. Some will call this the Sinaitic covenant. And then probably maybe less accurate, but still maybe more common is the Old covenant, right? So those would be the three ways that most people will refer to this covenant relationship. And then we also see again, verse 7, what do they agree by way of the conditions?
To obey.
Obedience, right? Obedience. So in verses 9, Moses and Aaron now go up. Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders, it says that they go up, but we're going to see that this is not all of them will go to the top and to the very presence. In verse 12, Moses now goes up on the mountain, and verse 13 tells us that Joshua also went up. Verse 14 tells us that Aaron and Hur, they were to remain below while Moses and Joshua went up, and the elders were not in this group. They were to be in the group with the priests. And so in verse 15, Moses goes up, and at this point, we're told that Joshua is not a part of that. Maybe Joshua was included, maybe he wasn't. But verse 15 only tells us that Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. Verse 16, and the glory of Yahweh dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the seventh day, he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. Now, isn't it interesting? We just looked at day 7 in creation week. How long did Moses have to wait? 6 days. 6 days. It's not a coincidence that there is 6 days, and then on the seventh day, Moses is called by Yahweh to come and meet in the midst of the cloud. Verse 17 then reads, in the appearance, which is to say the display of the glory of Yahweh was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop in the eyes of the sons of Israel. Then Moses entered the midst of the cloud as he went up to the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9, as well as 1 Kings 19, verse 8, tells us a little bit more information. Moses was said to have fasted 40 days and 40 nights on top of the mountain, who also fasted 40 days and 40 nights, right? Right before Jesus did what? That's pretty tough. I would not expect you to know this answer. Yeah, so prior to that public messianic ministry of Jesus, which brought the consummation of the Messiah's work and his death, Jesus was led by the Spirit out to the wilderness for the 40 days of testing. So here we see Moses having a similar pattern. But what becomes very clear as we think about what God is doing in the covenant, the place that Moses has prior to the building, or at least the instructions for the building of the tabernacle, we see that this is analogous to first creation week. And then, so that connects us with prior to man's fall. And then the 40 days of fasting, we will see Jesus connects to that prior to what he did with his body in his death, resurrection, which Jesus said his body was what? The temple that he was going to tear down and raise up 3 days later. And that sequence was after, that is, giving his body as the temple of God's dwelling, and then raising it up 3 days later. That was after his 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. So in one sense, this chapter 24 is like this theological fulcrum or hinge that is connecting us with what was God's presence, or what did God do in creation, and what was its result? And then what did God do in the covenant with Israel at Sinai through Moses and its result? And what did God do in Jesus through his mediatorial work. All right. So this kind of, we see the connection points for all three, though it is not explicitly taught in the text, is it? The text doesn't make those connections for us, Shelley.
So I'm kind of confused because it says here that, at least in my version, that Moses went up on the mountain, right? And the cloud covered the mountain. And he was there for 6 days. And he waited. And then God called him and he went up on the mountain. It says Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. But I thought he was already on the mountain.
So you're jumping from verse 15 and then down to
18.
Yeah, so
Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, but I thought he was on the mountain.
he was. And so verse 18, and he was on the mountain for 40 days.
Yeah. But wasn't he already on the mountain in verse 15?
Yes. Yeah, so I think what we're able to, it's either that he may have somewhat changed in his position on the mountain, but we don't have anything as far as him going down from the mountain.
Yeah.
We just have the repeating of going up on the mountain. But here what we do see is that Moses is executing this mediatorial role in the covenant on the mountain in the presence of God. And in that sense, he is functioning just like we will see the priests will function in Israel in the tabernacle. But first, there's some observations that I think we can make here that will be, I find these things to be incredibly encouraging, and I think that they are significant when we see them. First, from Exodus 25 through 31, all that this is going to unfold for this are the words that were given to Moses on the mountain. So here in 24, we see Moses goes up to the mountain and he is functioning as the mediator for Israel in this covenant relationship with God. Now, when we start in verse 25 and go all the way through chapter 25 through chapter 31, we then will hear Moses telling Israel what was told to him when he was on the mountain. It won't be until Exodus 32 that he comes down off of the mountain. So, Shelley, we may could imagine that, okay, maybe there was some kind of movement of Moses on top of the mountain, but he's not going back down. He is remaining there. Moses comes down in chapter 32. So that's what chapter 24 frames up for us. Kevin.
In a hillbilly, Moses went up on the mountain, but he did not enter the cloud. Went up on the mountain. Mountains, clouds, usually the upper parts in the clouds. Went up, does not say he continued in his journey into the cloud. It may be the prepositions and directions, but it's not saying he went down. It's just he is continuing to go up on the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
It's a continuation.
That makes sense.
It does. Now here's some incredibly interesting ways that we can see a parallel or a pattern or a type or a program or a paradigm that is showing us that what God is doing in his covenant promises and the redemptive works that he's making as he makes relationships with these persons, starting with Abraham, is that this is not something different, it is the continuation to recover what was lost in man's sin in the garden. And this is when we're able to observe the parallels between Mount Sinai as a tabernacle and Eden, in one sense, as a tabernacle or God's dwelling place with man. First, Mount Sinai as a tabernacle in Exodus 19:11, we're able to see that the Lord comes down to Sinai before the people. In verse 20 of Exodus 19, Moses goes up to the mountain where the Lord is. So what is the mountain? Just as we rehearse chapter 19, verses 11 and 20. That's where God is. So you think of a tabernacle as the dwelling place of God. So the mountain already has been where God dwells before the people of Israel. In Exodus 19, verse 10, we were told that God's presence is among his covenant people, and therefore it required their consecration. In Exodus 19, verse 21, God's presence also required a safeguard for the people because God's holiness would destroy the people if they in their sin approached them. So there was restrictions given. The people could not touch the mountain. And so Moses becomes the mediator to be able to represent the people in that sense in the tabernacle, which is Mount Sinai. Now, this gives to us what I think is a theology to understand how God relates to his people in covenant. And it's not, there's newness to what is happening here, but it's not totally new. How did God relate to Adam and Eve in the garden? He walked with them in the garden in the cool of the evening. So the dwelling place of God was with man. And man in the garden could approach and commune or have fellowship with God. And there was no sin that separated God and man. So the demands of God's holiness God's holiness didn't demand the same things for communion or fellowship to be had with man because man was not sinful. Now we find that God is still, on the basis of his grace, making covenant relationship with his image bearers, such that there will be a place that God will come down and be present among them. But now we have to deal with sin. God has to give an account for sin. And so this theology of God's dwelling helps us to make a few observations. One, to be in relationship with God such that God's presence is something that you are granted access to requires that you were in covenant with God. Israel had to enter covenant with God before, even through Moses the mediator, they could have access to God. Right? So an idea that often is incredibly foreign from whether it's American evangelical Protestants or just people thinking about the Christian faith. But the idea that you just can, I think I want to have a relationship with God. I think I would like to approach God. I think I would like to have communion with God. That's absolutely insane to imagine that you can do that unless you enter into a covenant relationship with God and God provides for you in that covenant what is required of you to have access with him. Now, that's a difficult thing to communicate to people because there's no way in which we could be able to do that unless people are able to see, like, well, marriage works that way. That relationship, you don't enter into that relationship and have the dynamics that relationship offers unless you first enter into covenant. And so there's a few, and I basically would say that's about the only one that's left in our country. But that's one thing that we learned. The second thing that we learn here, and this is post-fall, this theology of God's meeting with his people now has to always take into account God's holiness. For God to enter into relationship with his people such that he will dwell among them requires that God cannot compromise his holiness in meeting with his people. So God now must provide a measure so that he will be able to be holy and also address the sins of his people. And so we'll get into all of the details, but we probably won't get too far into the details. There will be positive and negative ways in the covenant at Sinai that he is providing for this. Some of these will be positive, such as in chapter 28 and 29 and all of the book of Leviticus. And this is where you wash, you wear these clothes, you have this anointing, the priest will do these services for you. That's positive. That's something you do. That's something that you can, in one sense, you can utilize that service so that your sinfulness is not going to create a breach because God is holy. Now, some of them are negative. That is that God will restrict, God will not allow his covenant people to enter into his presence unless they have the necessary sacrifices. So the way in which we're already able to see at Sinai, what is the restriction already established? It's negative, but it's for the good of Israel. All right. Well, that's going to be an interesting one. They can see him, right?
Moses can go and talk to him, but they can't.
They could look upon the top of the mountain and they could see the display of the cloud and the lightning. But what were they forbidden to do? They couldn't touch the mountain. And that's already we see God has established a negative provision for the benefit of Israel because he is holy and he will not compromise his holiness even when he is dwelling among his people. Now, this will be developed with a lot more detail as we go further into the details of the tabernacle. And then after what happens in Exodus 32 in Israel's idolatry. But you can, at least those are big categories. Already we see that there is positive and negative provisions of God for his people so that God doesn't compromise his holiness and people are not destroyed because of their sinfulness. Mark. Okay. Yeah. It does. I mean, how long did Israel wander in the wilderness? Yeah, so yeah. So clearly we are able to see that the 40 does have significance. I don't have an answer for you, except to say there is a significance. I will try to learn one. I'm sure the answer exists, Mark. I don't know it. Yeah, but I would also say if they do, it's because the Bible teaches them. Right, so that's what we were able to see as Sinai provides for us a theology of God's dwelling among his people. This is significant for us to realize. So you, Christian, you don't get to say, therefore, this doesn't apply to me. If God so dwells among his people now, he has to still provide for these things. He's not compromising his holiness. And he also has to provide for what about our sinfulness? So the new covenant relationship is also going to deal with these requirements of the theology of God's dwelling among his people. But here we also see that in that sense, the way in which we think about the dwelling of God among his covenant people is tabernacle, temple, and Mount Sinai is, in that sense, the first one. This harkens us back, however, to creation, and this is I find this really fascinating. That we know how many acts of God occurred in creation week. That would include even the seventh day, where God sanctifies and blesses the seventh day. 7. How many acts in Exodus are done by God in the construction of the tabernacle? Take a wild guess. 7. When God does in those 7 acts of creation, how does he initiate and accomplish those divine acts? He speaks them. He speaks them. Let there be. How do you think we're going to find that the 7 acts of establishing the tabernacle How do you think he does those? Same way, it'll be by divine word. And so if you want those, here are the 7 acts in Exodus 25, verse 1, Exodus 30, verse 11. That's number 2. Exodus 30, verse 17 is number 3. These are the 7 acts of God in divine speech in the construction of the tabernacle, in the order and what he's saying the tabernacle will be. It's 7 acts of divine speech, just like how did God make the world? 7 acts of divine speech, which gives us, let me run through those in case you want to write them down. The 4th is chapter 30, verse 22. The 5th is chapter 30, verse 34. The 6th is chapter 31, verse 1. And the 7th is chapter 31, verse 12. So how did God make the world? Through the 7 divine acts of the 7 days of creation that were accomplished by divine speech. How does God make the tabernacle? Through 7 divine acts of that are done through 7 divine words of God, which show what then is the tabernacle in a sense. It's kind of like it's a new Eden. It's a new place where God now comes down and he dwells among everyone. No, he dwells among his covenant people. And like Adam, what does Israel, the covenant people of God, what do they have? After they enter covenant, and what does God give them? The 10 words. What did Adam have in the garden? He had the one word.
The commandment of what to do and not do.
That's so we will see. So some theologians think, not most Reformed covenantal theologians, but one, Meredith Kline, does think that the covenant at Sinai could be like a reiteration of the covenant with, if God did make a covenant with Adam in the garden. That here we see a new place that has parallels to the creation of the world. And here is God's new people, whom he already has called. What did God say Israel is? My son. Because Pharaoh was to let his son go. And he has given to them his commandments. And in that sense, I think that there is more parallels in the Sinaitic covenant with what took place in the garden. So that here we are seeing the descendants of Abraham, who now are a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. They are, in one sense, given another covenant that has very similar reflections as that relationship with Adam in the garden, and we will see how they do. But in that sense, we at least could say that it seems that the theology of this tabernacle complex that is going to be built in the midst of Israel is the basis which the New Testament comes along and teaches that the individual believer becomes the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19. And the blood of Christ is the means by which the believer's heart is made approachable to the holy God. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 25 and 26. So in the same way, the people entered into the covenant when the blood of the sacrifices fell upon them, and then they had access to God's dwelling in this covenant relationship through Moses. The greater Moses, the greater covenant, the greater, in one sense, presence of God has now been given to the believer through Christ's blood, where we indeed approach God in him. Right? That you see how the same framework exists in the garden, exists now here in this covenant, and then exist perfectly and permanently in Jesus Christ and the covenant that he gives. Right? So that is helpful for us to learn, and we learn it here in Exodus. There's other similarities when we get into the details, and I'm going to have to go pretty quick, so I'm going to confess I'm going to cheat you on the details. But when you get into the details of the tabernacle, and then you go back to Eden, you will see some similarities. Both contain pure gold, both contain precious gold, both contain cherubim as guards, and those are explicit in both accounts in the Torah. The creation and the tabernacle brings about a rest. In Exodus 31, verse 12 and 18, Israel will be called to honor the Sabbath. So in that sense, the rest of Israel, their Sabbath requirement is because of the tabernacle is now in their midst, in the same way that rest after the creation was what God did because God was in the midst of creation. We also see that, like creation, the tabernacle in chapter 39, verse 43, is both given divine approval and divine blessing. Just like God at the end of chapter 1 gave creation divine approval and divine blessing. We see another similarity that humanity in creation is made in God's image. And we will see over and over again, but chapter 25, verse 9 is one place. What is the tabernacle constructed in? The heavenly pattern that Moses is shown. So the tabernacle is, in one sense, a recreation of the image of God's dwelling place in heaven in a similar way to God creating mankind in his image on earth. Last way that we see a similarity between creation and the tabernacle. Creation's fall occurs after the first two chapters of the narrative of its creation. So when do you think we come to see Israel's fall? After the narrative of the tabernacle's creation. From chapters 24 through chapter 31, we have all the details of the tabernacle's construction and the likeness of the heavenly abode of God. And it will be in chapter 32 that we read of the account of Israel's idolatry as Moses has been meeting with God on the top of the mountain. So Israel has been sinning against God below the mountain, which means the covenant has already been broken. Again, I don't think that's an accident. I think this is intended to teach us. God's heavenly abode directed his earthly tabernacling among Israel, and the nature of the tabernacle in Israel is intended to have symbolic value of the reality of God in heaven. The typology, in one sense, is the intent of the tabernacle. This is why I want to take you back. This is where we see an already not yet in Exodus. Because the end for which God commanded the Exodus events is so that it would end in them having life with God. Here we're able to see the tabernacle itself, though God dwells there among his people, is that God's dwelling place? Well, because it's made in the likeness or in the pattern of the heavenly abode of God, what do you know about it? It's not the final place. So there's sort of built into the very nature of the tabernacle a typology of something that is beyond the tabernacle. And so there is a future hope, a future orientation, a continuation of what is the faith of God's saints in this relationship. What are they ultimately aiming for? not this tabernacle, but rather that which it represents. So that's some of the theology that I think that we are able to receive. The New Testament goes on to develop this significantly, and I'm out of time to go ahead and get to that. So let's go incredibly quickly through some of the details of the creation of the tabernacle. In chapter 25, we see that there are offerings in the first 9 verses that are to be given for the construction of the tabernacle. And here we see that there is yet another parallel between Eden and the tabernacle, because these offerings are royal offerings, and they also are marks of the Garden of Eden. In verses 10 through 22 in chapter 25, we see the ark is required to be built and placed in the tabernacle. And that's where the 10 words are to be placed. There is to be an atonement cover, and it is to be guarded by 2. They're not literal cherubim. They're made cherubim, indeed, and they represent the dwelling place of God. Traditionally, Christians have seen this as a typology of Christ. And in one sense, you can see how it makes sense, but you don't necessarily see it explicit in the text, do we? We go to verses 23 through 30, and we see the table. The table is overlaid with gold, and it's got what is called horns. That is to say, at its corners, it sort of rose up so that we would say they sort of look like horns. And there the showbread was to be held. Upon this, we see there is a lampstand in chapter 25, verses 31 through 40. It took 100 pounds of gold to make it. Very specific instructions are given to the design of the lampstand. And then we are told about the tabernacle in chapter 26. The tabernacle is, in one sense, one unit. We're to understand it to be one thing. Thus, we call it the tabernacle. But it's made up of 3 structures. In that sense, it moves from a holy of holies, and then there is think of it as like concentric rectangles or concentric squares. So that the most center, and though they're not perfectly center, it's sort of like they are divided to the right side. But the most inner rectangle is the Holy of Holies, and it was indeed a certain curtain, the veil, that separated it from the second square. And the second square would also have a veil, but it would be a curtain, and it would be made of goat hair, and that would be where the tent began. And then beyond that, there was another, in one sense, tent, and it would be skins laid over the poles that erected that. And all of this, in one sense, in your mind, you just need to think of tents. They are a series of tents that are separating God's dwelling and his people's ability to approach it. And all of this is the tabernacle. Clearly, the New Testament teaches us something about what Jesus accomplished in his body. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 20 describes Jesus's body in a way that is akin to the tabernacle. It was Christ's body that was torn that enables God's presence to have access to God's people. Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 and 51 describe the veil being torn from top to bottom after Jesus's death on the cross. And so we clearly understand that the New Testament says that the tabernacle shows us a portrait of what Jesus has achieved for God's people. From there in chapter 27, we are told about the altar. Hebrews 13, verse 10 refers to another altar that those who served this altar couldn't even access, meaning that Jesus, in God's heavenly presence, gave himself. This was a representation of the presence of God, but an altar is where sacrifices would be placed. In chapter 27, verses 9 through 19, we have a courtyard, and that is the outer, sort of the outer area outside of the Holy of Holies. And then verses 20 and 21 tell us about that's where the oil for the lampstands was to be kept. Here in this sort of series of concentric squares, you can say that that which was going to be used for the Holy of Holies, for the inner tent, it had to be, some of it, if it was to be used as oil for that, it would have to be kept just outside, and it was to be exclusively for use in the Holy of Holies. When it came to what the priest would wear when he entered into the Holy of Holies, those garments are described in chapter 28, that would have to be donned before he entered the Holy of Holies. And Moses gives the details from who could do it. It would be Aaron and his sons. What would he wear? The ephod, the breastplate, the ephod robe, the gold plate, the tunic, the turban, the sash, and undergarments. All of this was related to, one, what was he serving? He was the priest. He represented the people. So all the garments represented the ones whom he was going into the presence of God for. So from the stones to what was graven on the breastplate, it was the 12 tribes of Israel that represented the people as the priest wore these clothes going into God's presence. It also signifies that there's a certain kind of dignity and honor with what he was doing for the people in the presence of God. That's especially true when it comes to the tunic and the turban and the sash, told to us in chapter 28, verses 39 through 41. His undergarments in the end of chapter 28 is because what does God's holiness never allow God's presence to ever see? Human nakedness. Human nakedness. And so not only does he have to don himself with this outer attire, but he even has to make sure that in no possible way could human nakedness ever be exposed into the Holy of Holies. And so all of these requirements are given to Moses in chapter 28. Shelley.
So human nakedness was normal in the Garden of Eden before the fall, but now it's not to be seen.
Correct.
So what has changed?
Sin. So here would be like, if you really want to, we're not going to do this, but if you want to chase this down, it's an interesting cultural implication. When you look at the way Christian and Jewish theology thinks about human nakedness, it is not the way the Greeks and the Romans and non-Christian cultures, even if they weren't exposed to Judaism, they didn't think of human nakedness in that way.
Yeah.
Even the way you think of human nakedness is now understood is fundamentally contrary to the way in which you would observe nakedness in Scripture. So ever since sin in the garden, human nakedness is not something that you would sort of parade and think that's something that God can be pleased with. It's to be separate. We know that there is a place for it.
Wasn't shame.
Correct. So in this way, you see it built into the requirements even of the high priest's attire, because the consequences would be grave if he went in and his nakedness ever shone upon the elements of the Holy of Holies. The priests then were to consecrate themselves, their clothes, with sacrifices, a meal, and a ceremony. And this is told to us in chapter 29. And then in chapter 30, we're told of the altar of incense, the atonement money, which is tough to swallow, was a tax that God had upon all of Israel to sustain the tabernacle's expenses. We're told of the wash basin, the anointing oil, the incense. And then in chapter 31, we learn of the two spirit-empowered craftsmen that build the tabernacle and all of the human-made instruments of it, which is interesting. And this harkens us back to creation. Who created? Who created the universe? God did, but what was it that was hovering over the waters of the deep? The Spirit. And so we were able to see, even though Bezalel and Aholiab, I never can get that guy's name right. Though they were the human instruments who created all of these elements of the tabernacle, who empowered these craftsmen to make what their hands made? The Spirit of God. Then in chapter 31, verses 12 and 17, we come to a Sabbath. Verse 16 tells us that this Sabbath is given for all generations of Israel to celebrate, but it is associated directly with the tabernacle. And thus, this Sabbath of Israel is a sign of what the tabernacle signified for Israel, that God dwells among Israel. God's presence is in the tabernacle among Israel. And so all of Israel's work throughout the 6 days was a holy task, and their rest was to be on the seventh day. Moses gives the conclusion in verse 18 of chapter 31, when Moses, in that sense, goes behind the veil of the mountain and he is talking with God. And immediately in chapter 32, we now turn. What was happening while Moses was behind the veil, so to speak, and meeting with God? That's right, idolatry, which we've already talked about in the first. We've read of in chapter 20, we've read of the 10 Commandments, and there we are able to see that the emphasis in the first prohibitions are against idolatry. And then in chapter 32, where we might not be surprised to find what is the first sin that violates the covenant that they just entered. Idolatry. And so in the first 6 verses of chapter 32 explains the making of the golden calf. Verses 7 through 14 goes back to Moses, who was on the mountain, starting in verse 17, as he is with God. And he comes down from the mountain. I'm going to read verses 11 through 14. Then Moses entreated the favor of Yahweh his God and said, O Yahweh, why does your anger burn against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a strong hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountain and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent concerning doing harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by yourself, and you said to them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and all this land of which I have spoken I will give to your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. So Yahweh relented concerning the harm which he said he would do to his people. Here we're able to see, what does this petition of the mediator of Israel with Yahweh, their Lord, what does he connect God's mercy to now the covenant-breaking nation of Israel?
Promise with Abraham.
Exactly. It is the Abrahamic covenant. It's God's promises to Abraham that Moses entreats Yahweh, have mercy on Israel. Relent from judging this covenant nation because of the basis of your promises made to Israel.
Right there, I will multiply your.
Yes. Yeah. Verse 13 connects it with the promises made to Abraham. And so here we are able to see that fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant is going to come through God's purposes in the Mosaic covenant or the Sinaitic covenant. And so we then are able to see, how then does Israel how does Israel relate to the covenant that they made with Yahweh through Moses at Sinai? They break it. They're covenant breakers. How now will God have to relate to Israel? With what? Or mercy. And so in chapter 32, verses 15 through 35, God does bring judgment. And the judgment covers this. We see that Moses calls Aaron to account for his actions. And idolatry was not the only thing. It was associated with they had no control. Later on, there's other language that we will learn, like 1 Corinthians chapter 10, as well as elsewhere. Sexual immorality seems to have been a part of this. And what rises up is that there is, look at verse 28. So the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. This is where we're able to see in Numbers, it is because the sons of Levi went and slaughtered the idolaters within the nation, that is the reason that it is the tribe of Levi that become the priests, the Levites. It's because their actions on this day. And so in verse 30, we read, now it happened on the next day that Moses said to the people, you yourselves have committed a great sin, but now I'm going up to Yahweh. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. And Moses returned to Yahweh and said, alas, this people has committed a great sin, and they have made gods of gold for themselves. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out from your book which you have written. And Yahweh said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. But now go, guard the people where I told you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I will punish them for their sin. Then Yahweh smote the people because of what they did with the calf which Aaron had made. So we see here the two things that will become to be explicit when Yahweh comes to have his name proclaimed by Moses, and that is that he is just and merciful, that he forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, but he also will not let sins go unpunished. And so in this way, we'll go forward and we'll see that this creates a totally reordered relationship within the Sinaitic covenant. In chapter 33, all the way through chapter 34, we see a reordered covenant between Israel and Yahweh. In Numbers 3, there's some further elaboration about the Levites are now chosen to be the priests, and the covenant has changes in form. In verses 1 through 6 in chapter 33, now God will use an angel where before God did not. On one hand, this is indicating that there is a greater distance in the relationship, because there's another level of a mediatorial role that the angel will have. But at the same time, it's also gracious, because what is Israel clearly illustrating? They are sinful, and they break God's commands. We see in chapter 33, verses 7 through 11, that it's now called the tent of meeting. And now it will be, Yahweh will only meet with Moses at the tent of meeting. And so Israel has another layer, so to speak, of separation from Yahweh in the reordered covenant relationship because of their covenant breaking in chapter 32. God's glory in verses 12 through 23 is displayed differently compared to before. So if you were to read in chapter 24, verses 16 through 17, you see a difference in the display of God's glory to Israel. The stone tablets in chapter 34, we now see they are different. There's some details that can be a little bit difficult as to who wrote these stone tablets. Was it Moses? Was the Lord? But in verse 27 in chapter 34, we read, Then Yahweh said to Moses, Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have cut a covenant with you and with Israel. I think there's reason that some Old Testament scholars say this is the same covenant at Sinai, but it's now having to be re-entered. So it's sort of like a rededication of the covenant relationship again. And so there is a different stone tablet that is given to Israel, and it seems that Moses wrote those words. The first one was written by God's hand. It is an expansion of the covenant code, which was given in chapter 23, verses 13 through 19. And now God's glory is not going to be displayed directly to Israel, but rather it is going to be displayed upon Moses' face, because Moses was the one who was able to be present in the display of God's glory, the tent of meeting. The tabernacle in chapter 35 comes to be constructed, but first the Sabbath is demanded. The first 3 verses of chapter 35. Materials had to be given. Craftsmen, again, are delineated. The people respond in approval, and construction is done at the end of chapter 36. As we come to the end of Exodus, what we're able to see after all of this has been made, that the final conclusion after the tabernacle is completed is that God approves of it. And then he comes to fill it. Starting in verse 34, Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had dwelt on it. The glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Now throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the sons of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day when it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of Yahweh was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel. So despite Israel's sin, despite the covenant being broken, does God achieve what he said that he would achieve? He is now present, dwelling in the midst of his people. But in the course of this, we are able to see that there is now a greater separation, and there has been a greater increase of laws that have been given and restated to Israel. This is going to be significant as we keep going through the Torah, because one, we will see that what does law do for sinners? It exposes their heart. What is necessary for the covenant to continue? God has to be gracious with them. God has to look upon them mercifully for the sacrifice which will stand in their place, and their sin will be forgiven. With that, we go next into Leviticus, which is often where you drop off when it comes to your Bible reading. But I think you're really going to like Leviticus. So,
Second Chronicles right now.
I passed it up with Leviticus for the first time, like ever.
Really?
So Will, what is the significance, or is there significance of Moses grinding up the calf, putting it in the water, and making the people drink it?
Yeah.
Was it to give them the sort of a bitterness of their sin, or have you?
yeah, I do. I think, and so here's the repeated thread. What does the Lord give people? Like, in one sense, it's a sign of his judgment, but it also is graciously used by God in his elect.
Like more of what they think is gonna fulfill them.
Exactly. God gives you more of what you want. So a sign of God's judgment would be when God gives you more of the sin that you want, you're hardened, you were dulled, and you just go deeper into your sin.
Romans chapter
Yeah, but when God also gives more of what you want, how does that work out in the lives of his
Like
saints?
the quail.
Yeah,
They had it coming out of their noses and they hated it.
yeah,
Like
so,
the judges.
It's the changing desire of the heart.
yeah, so I think it is, they tasted what they did
Yeah.
so that they would remember. You want to break my commandments and to chase your wicked desires for false gods? Drink it.
But wasn't it, so the people that were made at that point were only the sons of Levi, right? When Moses called them out and said, if you are for God, come down, and those men slaughtered everybody else.
The only 3,000.
Not
Yeah,
everybody else.
yeah,
Well, I mean, it says that.
yeah.
It
They
says every man and their neighbor and everybody associated with them who didn't stand for God in that moment.
yeah. They didn't slaughter all the tribes. So I do think we have to infer from there that there, because that would eliminate the 12 tribes if that was the
It didn't
case.
slaughter everybody that was there, because that's
No.
the language of the text.
No, I think what it did is it slaughtered. It seems to indicate that it was not all of Israel that had
There.
devoted themselves in idolatry. Even though the nation is judged as covenant breaking, it seems as if the slaughter was of some, not all.
Like the people that were.
Just the
participating in
people
that.
who were.
Yeah.
The rest of the tribes, they'll have their chance to sin.
Yeah, yeah, it continues, but it is not the execution of everyone but the Levites. It isn't it the only way to understand it is for the 12 tribes to continue, which they did. They were there. Yeah, they were there. So it seems, because there's other aspects that sort of come to fore later on that indicate it was not just the acts of worshiping the idol. There was sexual immorality. And so there was in this language that we use, it sort of is like it breaks out. And so it doesn't seem as if it is sort of everybody equally. And so I think we have to infer the Levites executed those with whom it had broken out. This will come up again with numbers as they wander, that the language will speak in a general fashion, and then there will be a divine judgment that will destroy some. And it is, in one sense, the judgment will also be saying about the whole nation, they're stiff-necked, but yet not all die. I think the same is the case with who the Levites executed. Feel free to go. If you have questions, we'll take those, but you've endured.